Good evening, everybody, and welcome to ASPI, and welcome to our session, Rethinking Deterrence, Irregular Answers to Conventional Problems. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal people, pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the role of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people in our Defence Forces. I'm John Frewen, I'm a Senior Fellow here at ASPI, and I'm also a former Chief of Joint Capabilities. And I'd also like to welcome our panel and the discussion that we are going to have on how Australia might better pursue its national interests through unconventional deterrence, an idea that is explored in an upcoming ASPI special report that will be out in the near term. The report looks at some gaps related to our deterrence, or potential gaps, some opportunities, and then some why and how we might take a different approach. With major capabilities such as nuclear submarines not due to arrive until the 2030s, we are arguably facing a deterrence gap until then. But there are potential opportunities to better embrace special operations, cyber capabilities, information effects, and denial tactics as part of an unconventional deterrence to raise costs, create doubt, and slow escalation without seeking to mirror our potential adversaries' seemingly overwhelming strengths. So, drawing on the paper with 3 of the 4 authors of the panel on the panel here tonight, we will ask why unconventional deterrence might suit Australia, what shouldn't and shouldn't comprise it, and how it might work in a practical sense. So, turning to our stellar panel, we have Professor David Kilcullen, who is the Professor of International and Political Studies at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. We have Brigadier retired Professor Ian Langford, Executive Director of Security and Defence Plus, also at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Dr. Andrew Maher, Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, and Courtney Stewart, who is the Deputy Director of Defence Strategy here at ASPI. I'll ask a series of questions and then we will have some time at the end to ask questions, so put your thinking caps on. David, we might start with you. So as one of the principal authors of the upcoming paper, could you give us an explanation of the broader concept of unconventional deterrence and why you think it might suit Australia's strategic aims?
Yeah, and thanks, JJ, for hosting, and thanks everyone for coming out. Right, I know everyone's super busy estimates this week, so appreciate you making the time. I also want to acknowledge our co-author, Sally Burt, who is actually tied up at Parliament House right now. If she were here, she would raise the level of discussion substantially. So what are we thinking about as we're approaching this paper that we've written? I'm going to start with what I think is an uncontroversial point, which is that any war between the United States and China would be an absolute disaster for Australia, even in the most unbelievably successful outcome of a complete military defeat and a generational setback for the PLA. Australia would still be in a position where our principal security partner is fighting one of our principal economic partners, and nobody comes out of that well. And again, American strategists are as alive to this issue as Australians are. So if, in fact, a war would be an absolute disaster and there's no functional win in that kind of a war, that means that the single organising principle for Australian statecraft for the next generation needs to be preventing that war. And if you think about what the defence contribution would be to that general whole of government strategy, it's captured in the NDS, it's captured in the series of documents that we're putting forward as a nation, but essentially it's deterrence. And as you said, we have a deterrence problem. If you subscribe to the notion of the Davidson window, which is not named after my wife, it's named after Phil Davidson, the former CNO, then the highest level of danger of a war is between now and about 2027. It starts to gradually decline after that. So you might say we have a 2027 deterrence problem. And at the most basic level, you can't solve a 2027 deterrence problem with a submarine that doesn't get here until 2032. So we have a gap. And we need to think about, whilst not making a comment on AUKUS or the submarines themselves, they are not actually going to solve the immediate problem. So what we've tried to do in the paper is look at some different ways of thinking about deterrence. And the first one, which is a really big one, is bringing in some recent scholarship that people have done on the concept of intra-war deterrence, or deterring in a conflict rather than to prevent the conflict. Because Western deterrence theory largely comes from the nuclear deterrence world, and there's always been an assumption that if a nuclear war breaks out, then there is no intra-war deterrence because it's the end of the world. That's a debatable proposition, by the way. But our deterrence scholarship has tended to focus on, if you fail to prevent the war, deterrence by definition has failed, and now you just go to a warfighting strategy. Brad Roberts at Lawrence Livermore, a number of other people have put forward what I think is a much more sensible approach, which is that you are trying to change an adversary's decision calculus both before the war breaks out and then after it has commenced at various inflection points, right? Trying to get them to not do something or to do something instead or go elsewhere. So how do you execute that? And we argue in the paper that special operations effects, a broader range of irregular warfare and special warfare effects, cyber, potentially space, and a bunch of other, what you might broadly designate as counter-hybrid type activities, can play a significant role in filling that deterrence gap. So I'll pause there because there's a lot more to say on that, but that's a basic answer to the question.
Sure, Dave. So what type of scenarios do you see an unconventional deterrence approach being relevant to?
So primarily recognising the fact that, and we'll talk China here, right, that a beyond peer conventional adversary in our primary area of military interest doesn't actually have to approach the Australian shoreline in order to do significant damage to possibly even knock Australia out of a future conflict. And I'm thinking, for example, of I haven't seen the latest Department of Energy stats, but if you look at stocks on hand, the country typically has about 4 weeks worth of liquid petroleum available to power our entire economy, right? So somebody cuts off major shipping routes, closes the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, the country runs out of fuel in 4 weeks. That's the sort of chokehold on Australia that you can't defend against from our own territory. So some people are familiar with Sam Rogovin's echidna strategy, which sparked, I think, a very valuable debate in the strategy community. But obviously, echidnas don't project force, right? We need to be able to project force into the primary area of military interest and arguably beyond it in concert with a coalition partner in order to change an adversary's decision calculus before they get close to our territory. If we've got a Chinese ATG sitting off Darwin, it's already too late. So that's the scenario where I think we would play a role.
Sure. So, Andrew, if Australia was to adopt an unconventional deterrence approach, what do you think should be included in a strategy like that, and what shouldn't be a part of it?
Thanks, John. The approach we took with the paper was also highlighting the analogy of having been here before. The particular section that talked about some of that history examined the Japanese lead up into projecting force against the Commonwealth. And one of the quirky elements of history is that prior to Pearl Harbor, Australia committed troops to support the nationalist Chinese with raising guerrilla warfare battalions that would impose cost on the Japanese. And the interesting aspect of that history was that the purpose and stated purpose in the archival documents was to deter the Japanese from projecting force against other elements of the Commonwealth, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. And so at some point in time, there was a belief that by imposing cost and creating these sort of dilemmas through resistance networks, that you might be able to influence the decision calculus. That's fascinating by virtue of the echo of history that we've seen in the response to Russia's escalation in 2022, and arguably, of course, the adaptation in European security policies following the seizure of Crimea in 2014. But from a theory perspective, we also looked at the other side of the equation, a threat-based aspect of the equation, and unpacked how is it that Iran, as one example, is going about competitive statecraft. And for the last 20 years, we've seen the cultivation of the Iranian threat network, a network of proxies throughout Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon and Gaza that have a stated purpose of complicating the decision calculus of the United States or Israel should they choose to project force against Iran. Again, the logic here is that we can influence a decision calculus that we may be able to deter by shifting the point of action, classic horizontal escalation language, that suggests that the Iranian threat network might be viewed as a form of deterrence by punishment. But to your question, clearly that's not in. The support to terrorist actors would not fall in the calculus of what might constitute an unconventional deterrence strategy in Australia's context. Lastly, the paper looks at the two ends of those spectrums, where there are some things that have worked. There are, in the case, as Dave alluded to, of intra-war deterrence. The Swiss deterred Nazi Germany not once, but 3 separate times throughout World War II from mounting an invasion of Switzerland. But also it doesn't work. The display of a resistance capability in Ukraine, initiated by the Resistance Authorisation Law of July of 2021, 8-month lead time for developing resistance capabilities, but it wasn't quite enough to influence Putin's decision calculus. Unpacking that, understanding why that is useful for advancing the theory and working out what might work in an Australian context and how we might go about communicating that deterrence message.
Okay, so you've described a range of actions in there. How do you conceptually differentiate between things that might be called shaping, things that might be called compelling an adversary to act in a certain way, use of force or deterrence actions, and just sort of, so how do you see those being separated, and then how might we employ unconventional deterrence in ways that doesn't cause unnecessary escalation by adversaries?
The aspect of situating the employment of proxies or support to partners in a language of deterrence theory is in of itself new. That has a level of utility here. To a certain degree, I think there's another aspect to unpack of what is the adversary's theory of victory. And if it is to subvert, to weaken, to create a liminal warfare zone, as Dave's work has talked about, where there's a window of opportunity where you might be able to operate before decision thresholds are met. Again, that falls into classic deterrence theory language of detection thresholds, escalation thresholds, decision thresholds. And building that type of theory is key to what we're trying to do with the paper.
Okay, all right. Ian, why do you think irregular warfare and unconventional methods require more prominence within our deterrence approaches?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. And again, great privilege to be here this afternoon. Obviously, a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience. Again, for practitioners and policymakers, I want to acknowledge the hard work that you do and the challenge that lays ahead in terms of understanding the history of policymaking, particularly outside of declared wars historically, and just the sheer nature of getting decisions that translate into action in 2025. I mean, Andrew Shearer did us a huge favour in his speech this past week at the Australia-Japanese Business Council. For those that haven't read it, I think I'd encourage you to read it chapter and verse. There's a couple of dimensions around his sort of criticism in a very polite way of how we as the lucky country continue to prosper despite, to quote Donald Horne, our own accepted mediocrity. But certainly in that speech, he has really formulated what we already know, is that the notion that wars are declared anymore is now overtaken by events. The reality is that threats to national security come inside and outside the traditional military context. And again, popular saying that text without the context is just a con. And if you take that and you think about it in terms of our traditional definitions of conventional warfare, which goes all the way back to the Napoleonic period, is warfare by convention. That's in absolute terms, in the Oxford English Dictionary, that's what it means. It's warfare by convention. They are standards and protocols and systems that are deliberately predictive in nature, in one respect to offer deterrence in the pre-conflict moment, but in others to set limits on when one or two states in conflict can graduate from one level of warfare to the next. And again, if you haven't sort of refreshed your memory of Mearsheimer and Perret and others, you probably should, because in this age, we're certainly reflecting some of the upper limits of how far that theory of nuclear deterrence is relevant post-2025. And so if you accept that warfare conventionally is warfare by convention, then everything outside of that that presents as a threat to national security is by its very nature unconventional. So again, I don't want to be specific to the PRC, but I will focus on the CCP as the effort that I really want to sort of talk about today in the non-traditional, unconventional threat that we're talking about, and certainly Andrew Shearer alluded to. Others call it competitive statecraft. Some people call it coercion to compellence. Again, in the reference that we've produced, we talk about Singapore and its desire to become a poisoned shrimp. And I think, again, that really acknowledges you've got to be unconventional in the context of knowing that you have limits on power. You're a little fish in a pond of big fish. How do you become that poisoned shrimp? And also, as Lee Kuan Yew said, how do you get big states to accept your legitimacy as a middle power in the international system? And we have done that traditionally, really since the start of the 20th century through that approach of sort of forward defence in the context of using Great Britain and then the Americans post-World War II. We then go into defence in depth. We then go into defence of Australia. We then go into the peace dividend post-Cold War. Fukuyama said war is this thing that we don't need to deal with anymore, and yet here we are today. And so the realities of our circumstance as a middle power means that we only have so many means to so many ends. We're in an alliance framework that comes with obligations that gives us leverage in terms of how we might impact other people's decision-making abilities. Again, I'm talking about the CCP specifically. But let's think about outside the bounds of what we imagine high in conflict to be, what is happening around us that amount to effectively, in any other circumstance, a threat to sovereignty, or indeed in sort of 18th, 19th century language, an act of war that we now find ourselves having to deal with. And by that I mean things like the attacks on Mac Horton, the swimmer, who called out a certain competitor for steroid and drug abuse and then was subjected to years of harassment, from having glass thrown into the family pool to having direct threats made against his health and well-being. Think about Anne-Marie Brady in New Zealand, again, an academic that has spent her scholarship on calling out poor behaviour by large states in this region and the systemic campaign waged against her as an individual. What are the state's obligations to respond to those sorts of threats? Think about the strategic acquisition of critical infrastructure in the context of not necessarily using that as a forward operating base or a means to deploy military force, but as a way of thinking about, if we want to put sand in the gears at a certain point in time, this is how we're going to do it, okay? And having the ability to gestate a campaign across years where you can acquire infrastructure for that purpose. Everything from an information communications technology undersea cable in Melanesia, all the way through to certain ports and airports that come the day of the race, you will rely upon in order to force project or else. So they are all non-traditional threats that are now metastasising as state-sponsored actions in the context of militarily diminishing options for a middle power that relies on either its alliance frameworks or its ability to generate asymmetry in space and time, okay, that's about blocking the Sunda Straits or doing what have you, where there is always a limit on its ability to fight by convention. And so the question becomes, how do you employ national power to best effect when you have limited means? And again, this is what this paper seeks to sort of call out. What is the asymmetry and offset that the NDS talks about? What is the capability investments that need to be made now, not specifically to the ADF, but I'm talking about Australia as a nation beyond whole of government to include all of nation in the context of what is now an existential competition effectively for our right to assert our legitimacy in our part of the world, whether in an alliance framework or not. And that's where, again, we see opportunities, I think, in a deterrence framework to be able to really call out some of those capabilities that relate to emerging domains, space, cyber, undersea, on sea in particular, but also emerging technologies. And again, the 7 or 8 that are as part of Pillar 2 are really good sort of North Stars to think about asymmetry and offset. Not that we need to acquire all of them, but we've got to think about how they can be deployed in a non-traditional way to include those platforms and systems that we need for the high-end fight to again legitimise our own notion of sovereignty and our ability for self-determination in what is a competitive period leading up to 2027 and beyond.
So, Ian, if you had your druthers, what sorts of groupings of capabilities, be they special operations forces or cyber capabilities or information effectors, how would you group them and task them, and how would you see them being employed in the whole of government?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, I'm about function, not form. So again, and I agree 100% with Andy's observations historically, but history is an analogy, it's not a theology. And by that I mean, just because we haven't done it before doesn't mean we can't do it now. So let's think about repurposing existing systems in an offset and asymmetric way. The notion of stand-in forces, which is a US Marine Corps concept, I think is an inspiration as to how we might think about using current in-service systems in non-traditional ways that suit circumstances around laying and again using operational level deception, being able to employ and fully enable those agencies outside of defence to operate in a national security framework where authorities and delegations can be pushed down to levels that our senior decision makers can be comfortable with, but yet can enable observation, insight and action to happen in a confined space to contribute to a deterrence effect. I say this all respectfully because, again, I don't want to diminish the challenge that our people today have in getting freedom of action to do these things, and it is significant. But having said that, let's think about the integration of action elements of the ADF, intelligence elements of the AIC, and I mean the NIC, the other agencies. Let's be able to group them in a theatre context and let's put them on a specific problem. So we want to be able to turn on and off a specific waterway at a certain time. We're going to allocate this element to do that. And that might be a sense function and it could be an effect function using space, cyber, undersea and traditional. Let's think about the ability to forward deploy both all elements of the ADF in non-traditional ways in near permanent arrangements as it relates to being able to escalate and de-escalate near crises or moments of challenge. And by that I mean being able to permanently forward stage forces for the purposes of operational preparation of the environment. And again, I don't necessarily buy the argument that we talk about, going native. I've heard that about logistics. I'm not sure how you can run a land-based maritime strike system by going native. So it's not as if everyone's going to carry around Cooney knives and wear grass skirts and do what we did in the 1940s. That's romantic, it's lovely, it's almost irrelevant. The relevant piece is the geography and how we forward stage these high payoff assets in a way that we can achieve asymmetry in moments in space and time. For that, you need intelligence, you need persistent overwatch, you need access into high-level advanced capabilities, and you need to be able to do that in a way that you can effectively turn on and off all elements of the ADF and the broader assets of statecraft to be able to achieve those moments in space and time. So I will never buy the argument that this is a Napoleonic challenge. This is not trying to beat a military that's 20, 30, 40 times bigger than us. This is not a nation of 24 million people responsible for 8.8 million kilometres square of land, 10.8 of maritime, where the single optical surveillance ellipse of an MQ-4C Triton is 155 miles. We're not lining up the ADF and going that way, okay? It's not going to happen. We need to think about those asymmetries and offsets by using in-service capability differently, but then also knowing what we're really good at. Cyber, intelligence, space, and the ability to make decisions quickly if things have to go kinetic in moments in space and time. And that calculus needs to be communicated in such a way that our adversary knows about it. So the risk to them is just too much on any given day when it comes to putting a surface action group through a particular choke point, or whether it becomes incumbent on them to commit some sort of cyber undeclared attack, knowing that the reciprocity dimension is too high. Okay, this is a ones and nones capability, which we're very good at. How do you imply that that capability is what's coming back at you if you dare to foray into undermining sovereignty, if you dare to threaten the notion of our legitimacy outside of declared conflict in a way that protects us and makes clear to everyone that we are right to exist in the way that we say we are in a system where we're a co-equal with every other nation state in the international system.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So, Courtney, you are not one of the authors of the upcoming paper, but how do you think Australia should approach deterrence more broadly, and do you think this idea of unconventional deterrence should be a part of that thinking?
Thank you. I think you're a very hard person to follow. That was amazing, by the way. I think what I'm going to try to focus on is, when we look at our deterrence ambitions, I think what you've raised is Australia has options. Australia has a lot of options, but we tend to think of them in very traditional terms because for us, our deterrence ambitions are actually quite new. We've said deterrence or deter for many years, but we haven't truly tried to conceptualize it and operationalize it at a level that we're currently trying to do. And what we're finding is that it's actually quite hard. And how do we conceptualize our role in the region, and what does that look like if we're trying to deter, a beyond peer rival? And how do we work with our allies and partners to do that? So for me, my contribution, I think in this context, as not one of the authors, is to really look at, taking a step back and realizing, yes, we have options, but to just remember at the forefront that deterrence is a way. It is not an end state. It is not an outcome we're all trying to pursue. If you look at it in terms of ends, ways, means, and I'm sometimes a simple strategic thinker with many different ideas, but I like the conception of ends as outcomes, ways as approaches, means as enablers like capability, and that even includes things like time. But the ways that we generate deterrence effect, how do we do that to secure our political ends? And I don't think that we do such a good job in this country about what those are. What are we seeking to protect and uphold and secure, and what values matter to us? And when we say it's in our vital national interests, have we been very clear about what those vital national interests are? We have lots of interests, but which ones are vital? And for deterrence to be effective, you really need to come down on what is the most important thing that we seek to protect. And we need to be specific about that. To do that, as you mentioned, we need to be verbal and communicate and signal what those things are. Then we need to operationalize it by having the forces and the capabilities and the means to do so. That could be infrastructure, that could be data centers, that could be more helicopters, but we need to say what it is we're seeking to protect and identify what the threats are to those things. So if we're not clear on that, we're really going to struggle. So the ideas for doing things in an unconventional level, that could be completely valid. That could be one of our options that we need to pursue, but we need to be more honest with ourselves about, what are the priorities? everything cannot be a priority. But I think there are some very clear priorities, and I think that the next NDS is an absolute opportunity to move beyond, vague concepts of denial and deterrence. I do applaud all the efforts to elevate deterrence. I think it is an absolute critical way for us to pursue, but we can't do it effectively or credibly if we don't get more serious about how to operationalize that. I think one of the challenges, though, that I do see with using unconventional methods in a really practical sense is, again, defining that which we seek to protect. And the challenge with certain areas and domains, there's reveal and conceal, there's issues with attribution, and if we can't do some of those things, and this is where, if we do want to get serious about unconventional approaches, then we need to up our game in these other areas. So all of this is just to say that Australia's policy of strategic denial, it just really requires some hard choices and elevating within our own public and externally with our adversaries, as well as our partners and allies, what matters to Australia.
Okay, Courtney, you spoke about needing to better operationalise some of these things. Do you have a sense at the moment that there are sort of problems with that or impediments to achieving that?
I don't think we've done a great job of operationalizing it at the moment. I think there's many levels that you could look at this. There's the whole of nation level that's described in the DSR, this notion of national defense, and then a strategy of denial through that. How do we get the different instruments of government, the M across the dime, the diplomatic, the informational, the military, and the economic, how do we get all these departments working together in a coordinated way? There's some ideas for how you can do that. One of them, a popular one, is that we need to have a national security advisor. We don't have that. That could help to be, as you will, the belly button to pull these things together and to be kind of the mouthpiece for Australia, to send those deterrent signals, to be really clear on what matters to this country, but also, in a coordinated, intentional way, have all the different elements of our national power working together. There's no room for inefficiencies. We're not big enough. We don't have the leeway. Everything needs to be working in a concerted fashion towards, on an ongoing way, shaping the environment and at sometimes setting the theater for future crises and conflict, and doing it at a strategic level with our allies and partners. There's just so much more that can be done there. That's just at the big national level. Within each of the different departments and the different instruments of power, each of them plays an important role. And how are they living up to that role to contribute to an effective, credible deterrence approach, whatever that is? If we're going to try to use the concept of deterrence, through threats, through denial or punishment, how do we pull those things together? How do you ensure that we have adequate attribution? How do you ensure that the forces are forward postured for certain things? How do you ensure we have the information systems to have secure comms with our allies and partners? How do we do it in real time? Have we practiced this? Are we exercising all of these things? Do we have the critical infrastructure that we need to be redundant and be resilient? So all of these things, there's a lot of, bows that need to be tied.
Look, it's a really important point, I think. It's not just about theory. There's a practical issue here of how does defence play in a whole of government space, in a whole of nation effort in partnership with coalition. There's authorities and accountabilities and things that we need to think about. So thanks. Dave, at the heart of deterrence theory is credibility. How would Australia make an unconventional deterrence approach credible to our potential adversaries?
So I think just having a concept in the first place helps with that. And I think you asked earlier what distinguishes irregular deterrence from just a bunch of other irregular stuff that we would be doing. And it's the intent, right? The intent to deter. And obviously your ability to deter requires the ability to communicate credibly to an adversary what you're doing. If you're operating in a traditional clandestine or covert manner, by definition, to the extent that you're successfully clandestine, the enemy is not deterred because they don't know that you're doing it, right? So that's where this reveal, conceal element comes in that Courtney mentioned. It's extremely difficult to do that without a higher level national coordination across all the sort of different elements of the graphic equaliser. And you can speak better to this than me, but one of the most intense hatreds of the Second World War was between the Secret Intelligence Service and the Special Operations Executive, because SIS is out there trying to develop agent networks, collect data, facilitate larger scale operations and be quiet, and SOE keeps blowing stuff up in the middle of that in order to create a shorter term operational level effect. So we need a higher level coordination means. So having the concept, creating the higher level coordination means, and we suggest in the paper that it probably sits in PM&C at the National Security Advisor level, is essential. And then having the ability to clearly hold at risk assets that an adversary considers essential to their plan. And that could be through a deterrence through resilience, deterrence through resistance potentially, although that would kick in later in a campaign sequence, deterrence through punishment, or deterrence through denial, right? And all those elements would be there, as well as the notion of deterrence through disclosure, which we talk about in the paper, but it was something that was tried by the Americans immediately prior to Russia's invasion or full-scale escalation of Ukraine. It didn't work. And there's a reason for that, which is that America at that moment was not credible because of what had just happened in Kabul. So we have to think about that. So I think it may involve some uncomfortable things for people that are used to working in the irregular space. But to be super concrete about it, you know, what is unconventional deterrence in a military sense? There's a broader element that Ian talked about earlier, but in a military sense, it's the use of irregular forces and assets to achieve an asymmetric deterrent effect. And what are irregular forces? Well, they're non-state armed groups working either alone or in concert with special operations forces. And an armed group is any group that can inflict a lethal kinetic effect. So it might not be walking around with weapons. It might be hackers in a basement. It might be a space-based platform. It might be an economic asset. But if it can inflict a lethal effect and is an organised group that can work in concert with a broader strategy, then that's the sort of thing that needs to be brought into an overall unconventional deterrence approach. Clearly, defence does not own that alone, right? It has to be an interagency activity. Hence, again, why we think it's the coordination function is a PM&C function.
Okay, great. So you spoke about the reveal, conceal conundrum. Andrew, many of the capabilities that would be a part of an unconventional deterrence strategy are by their nature clandestine, if not covert. How would you see signalling a credible deterrent approach, the signalling of it be done without compromising the sources and methods that these capabilities depend on?
Our fourth author, Sally, would probably have some pretty strong thoughts about this, being a cyber expert, so indulge me for doing what I can. I've been quite interested in the emergence of the Ukraine IT army. From a point of view of when we use a language of resistance, we think the gallant images of French marquis out there, charcoaled faces, putting charges on railway lines, and that still may be valid. But it's also important to note that they were running underground newspapers. They were putting graffiti on walls. There was non-kinetics that were occurring at the same time. And my way of talking about resistance to students is think of crowdsourced warfare. What are we outsourcing to local populations to impose costs, create dilemmas on an adversary? March forward from that World War II example to Ukraine IT army. We've got a large group of people who are self-mobilising, drawn to supporting their nation engaging in open source int, PSYOPs activities, pre-bunking, debunking Russian narratives. There's a value proposition in all of that, almost none of which involves classified clandestine capabilities. Part of that delta that I've painted between Ukraine and World War II and the intervening period of the Cold War era is, of course, technology's marched forward. What used to be a exquisite state-based capability in the form of state-based, satellite-based surveillance systems are now commercially available out there to a much greater range of clients. In a similar way, when we start talking about other forms of technical surveillance, we're not necessarily talking about exquisite capability. We might be talking about what you can get at JB Hi-Fi. That matters. That significantly empowers the idea of crowdsourced engagement that might be able to help support a deterrence by detection type of denial of fait accompli actions. There's merit in that idea that I think is worthy of unpacking.
Okay, thanks. So Ian, on this reveal conceal conundrum, as a former special ops practitioner, which sort of capabilities do you think should be, overtly displayed as part of deterrence, leading, during this deterrence gap that we arguably have, and what do you think should be kept concealed and not revealed until an actual conflict?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Jay, again, because for many of those capabilities, you get to employ them once and then they're done. And so they need to sort of align to where the high payoff and at that moment in space and time that you want to impact to best effect presents itself and you can rapidly use them. There's also the alliance obligations that exist when other nations employ similar capabilities. So you're not just bringing risk to your ability to retreat, re-attack or re-employ that technology, but also the alliance as well. So that's never a simple question to answer. But I do think, having said that, I do think that there is a way that you can tier and hierarchy those capabilities so that you're not revealing everything, but you're revealing enough to suggest to the adversary that you have an escalation capacity to defeat their ability to respond. And certainly I think in the non-physical dimension of military deterrence, that certainly exists. So yeah, it's the ability of those very high level, very senior decision makers to act quickly, to understand that in terms of some of those key capabilities, you got one shot, how to best use them. But equally, there is a way, I think, to hierarchy and tier them so that you can demonstrate deterrence to the adversary without necessarily blowing the capability itself. The other thing too is your refresh rate. So this comes back to, we talk a lot in our industry policy, and the NDS talks about it as well, about AIC and the notions of sovereignty, and fuel's been brought up as one of those sort of key markers of how vulnerable we are in the event of disruption. But, what's the ability to build waveforms in this country right now? What's the ability to be able to essentially build those non-physical capabilities so that you've got a refresh rate that again is as relevant and as quickly as and as rapid as the capability itself. And to Andy's point, I think it's a really good one, that notion of how do you deploy, again, I'll come back to Napoleon, how do you deploy rage militaire? So, if you read, Chandler, he talks about taking the passion of the people post-French Revolution and effectively democratising warfare, which is how you raise a 1 million-person army and you move it from the English Channel to the Austrian Alps in 28 days, which you couldn't do today. So how do you do that? We've seen it in the Ukraine in terms of the ability to empower and mobilise non-traditional elements of society to help build these deterrent functions. It's a really interesting question for us here in Australia because, again, and to come back to Shearer's speech, and he wasn't being pejorative, but it's an interesting point. We didn't earn our democracy, we inherited it. We were given it. We've never not had it. And so this is not a question about, what is the quality of our citizenry, because they're up for it. But, at what point do they activate and acknowledge that that is under threat? And then how do you deploy that in the context of rage militaire to the fact that you can get cyber armies and you can get drone companies that are effectively organising around civil society as opposed to waiting for a contract out of CASG, which is never going to come. And again, I'm not being pejorative, but that's the reality of our circumstance. It's not Defence's job to mobilise this country in the face of a threat that exists outside the traditional realms of declared conflict. Yet at the same time, we need to not ensure that panic suddenly becomes, the main virtue of realising that we're in a situation that we need to now, in a way that we've never done before, find our way out of. And again, that tradition of strategy in this country is not promising, but again, history is not a theology, it's an analogy. We've got to self-determine now what those offset asymmetries are, what it means in an alliance framework, and what our triggers are for when we're going to use them. And it won't be, does anyone know what the Kra Isthmus is? For all of you historians out there?
Sure.
It's that little bit of skin in Malaysia where the Commonwealth forces were going to organise around either a Soviet or a Chinese advance down the peninsula post Second World War, in the Cold War. So we were going to duke it out on the Kra Isthmus. The communists were going to line up perfectly in column formation, look like something out of 300, and then it would be game on. And it would all be over, we'd win, rah, rah, rah. That thing doesn't exist. And acknowledging that, in that we don't get to choose to fight the way in which we think we might, and we don't get to decide when that's going to happen, I think activates these important thoughts and considerations about how you bring sovereignty to asymmetry and offset, and what are your triggers for how you're going to use them.
Great.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm noting the time. We do want to leave some time for questions, but just switching track a little bit. Cyber's been mentioned a few times, and in the paper there is some very stark, alarming demonstrations of just the sheer scale of Chinese cyber capabilities. Absolutely overwhelming if you take it at face value. Courtney, do you have any ideas on how we could better achieve cyber deterrence now in the face of that sort of threat?
Well, I think, using deterrence in a way to prevent unwanted actions in the cyber domain is incredibly difficult. And this is because a lot of the basic ingredients of deterrence are either missing in that domain or are very weak. And so, things like attribution, confirming who you're deterring, who is doing the intrusion, who is coming in and destroying your networks, who is trying to steal your data, whether or not that threat can be called out, and what action you seek to respond to in a public way, that's incredibly difficult to do. Issuing credible threats, and that is a common ingredient in deterrence, is, if you do this, we will respond with Y, How do you issue that in the cyber domain? And then how do you actually do that in a time within a bureaucracy? And this gets back to the operationalization and the coordination issue. How do you get everyone ready enough? How do you have the attribution done in time to then, respond if you had even issued some sort of deterrence threat in advance? So that would be telling, the CCP, if you do X, if you try to, infiltrate this, if you try to take this down, if you affect us in this way, be prepared, you will be punished, you will be denied. Issuing something, I'm being really blunt and black and white about it, of course it's much more subtle than that, but can we actually do that? And if we can, we need to be a bit clear about that, and we're not. And actually with attribution, I just don't think that if we're waiting months to be able to figure out that there has been an intrusion, or have the sort of intelligence to prove who had committed the crime or the act, months later, is it still deterrence? Or at that point, it's already been done. Then maybe it's just escalatory. So I think it's an area that many people have sought to address, but I think that this paper goes to try to unpack that a bit more.
Great. All right, so it's consequences for actions. All right, now, just wrapping up before we go to questions. So just drawing on Andrew Shearer's speech, I took a shot of a quote in the paper today. And this is part of his speech. Cyber attacks, political interference, disinformation, economic coercion, and the use of paramilitary and proxy forces to pressure and intimidate are now routine, right? It's happening. You know, coming out of defence, the cyber domain fully contested, the space domain fully contested, right? So we are in an environment where this stuff is happening now. We need deterrence now. There is a revision being worked at the moment of the National Defence Strategy. It will be released next year. I'll come along the line. One very brief thought on what advice would you give to those people holding the pen on the National Defence Strategy in relation to deterrence?
I'll latch onto the proxies part, that being a particular study area. In 25 years worth of defence policy, open source, that's the first time we've called out proxies.
Yep.
This year. Of course, the ASIO threat briefing in January being one of the first times that we've called that out.
Great.
So my advice would be that's good that you've identified a threat that has been active for at least the last 25 years. Keep going.
Great. All right, proxies, Dave?
That quote you just gave from Andrew Shearer, that exact same quote, but just with the insertion of the word deter, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about, right? To deter pressure, coercion, intimidation, right? So it's almost a layered strategy. And I would recommend, and we have this in the paper, numbers have written about it, take a look at Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Singapore, Taiwan. People have cracked the code on the notion of how to, as a smaller state, deter a beyond peer adversary, not only before the war breaks out, but through a conflict. And there's just a lot out there that we can do.
So if you like the term, it's, you know, grey zone is here now. We need to be addressing it now.
Yeah, it's counter grey zone or counter hybrid, right? Which doesn't include pure defence. Nobody ever won a hybrid conflict by, you know, purely defending. Yeah.
Got it. Ian?
Obviously all that, and give SOCOM everything they want.
Excellent. And Courtney?
They just need to be, just to jump on the train here, I think we need to be really clear about what the threats are and what the challenges are, and be honest with our public so that we have the social license, so that we can buy all the things that we need and get all of the things we need. The NDS is an extremely powerful tool. It signals to our allies or adversaries, but most importantly, it signals to our public so that we can move forward.
Sure. Great. Hey, thanks very much. So we're going to go to questions now. We've got until 5:30. Please raise your hand, accept the microphone, identify yourself, and then if you do have someone to direct the question to, do so, but otherwise I'll offer it to the panel.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Excellent discussion. Lithuania's ambassador, Darius Degutis, so thank you very much for mentioning Lithuania. Well, sorry. My question is from outside, you know, not the question which is related to the Australian members of this important discussion, but allow me to ask that question. Situation in the eastern flanks of NATO is tense because of multiplying intimidations and provocations by Russia. The armed Russian jet fighters violated Estonian airspace. At least 20 Russian attacking drones entered Poland and Romania. Cyber attacks in different European airports, drones over a number of military bases in Germany, Denmark, Norway. As you know, we in the Baltic states, for a number of years, were investing into our defense. At the moment, it's 5% of our GDP in Lithuania. 12 years ago, we introduced conscription. This week, in Lithuania, we have a nationwide mobilization exercise of Lithuania's ability to respond to security crisis, and distinct siren sounds will be used in every Lithuanian city. Now, my question is, could you kindly tell me, because the situation is becoming much more tense in this part of the world since the increasing growth of the Chinese presence, Australia, of course, recently signed security agreements with PNG, Nauru and Tuvalu, if there is any possibility that Australia might be introducing conscription either to serve in Australian Defence Force or to do some other forms of the national service. Thank you.
Let me go first. No. But I would just say that one of the identified weaknesses in the Australian repertoire of capabilities is the ability to mobilise large numbers of reservists. I apologise, Ambassador, I don't know the numbers for Lithuania. I know the numbers for Estonia, right? Population of 1.5 million, they can put 300,000 reservists on the street in a weekend, using the Estonian Defence League and their own reserve and the territorial structure. We have nothing like that. We have historically had that capability up until the Second World War, but we have not had that in recent memory. We've just done a reserve forces review. It didn't talk about these kinds of issues. So I do think that's a key part of the capability set that we need to be thinking about. I would defer to the others on this, probably Ian best qualified to answer. I don't think there's any political chance of the introduction of conscription.
No, and again, historically with the current government and its political party, it split twice over referenda on that in the First World War, and that seems like a long time ago, but in the history of a political party, it's not. Respectfully as well, I was at DSCI in London 3 weeks ago, and all the Baltic states were, telling me 18 months. That's the threat window that they're now dealing with for context. And what's really interesting was that certainly in the market at that event, it was all about counter-UAS, counter-drone, offset asymmetry technologies, recognising that Russia is a country of such size and significance that, again, you're never going to have a one-on-one parity where you're going to come out in front. So you've got to look for how you achieve those advantages in non-traditional ways. So it speaks to certainly what we've been talking about today, but the situation your country finds yourself in. The one, again, I've got a lot of confidence that, we will be successful. And one of those things that I think is synonymous with Europe and with Australia is because we're largely immigrant nations, we're not ethnocentric. The CCP, and I talk about CCC specifically, but you can say this about the PRC to a greater degree, if you're not Chinese, you're out of luck. And so that singular worldview, to my mind, will be part of their undoing. And in the context of alliance frameworks and how you build partnerships to achieve scale in a way that offsets the mass that others have and always traditionally used, I think that's happening. I think it's happening in Europe, notwithstanding the challenges. And I think to some degree it's happening with what we saw this week with, an alliance agreement with a country that, is 50 years old, which, in reality we should have had that alliance on day one of its independence, but they weren't ready. So, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of different ways that we can achieve that level of scale. But in this country, conscription is something that, again, it would be a different decision at a different point in time. Now, again, if a Chinese Tomahawk went through a building here, things would change very quickly. And again, how do you achieve that rage militaire once the populace activates? How do you turn that into deterrence capability? And I think part of it is having these sorts of conversations.
So, Ambassador, Australia had compulsory national service by ballot for the Vietnam War. It was a very divisive issue. For many decades, the C word, conscription, could not be raised by policymakers. But it's interesting that it is now entering public discussions like this. In the UK, it's being raised publicly by sort of senior military figures. So, it has a troubled history here, but it's interesting that it's back.
One of the things we do talk about in the paper is that there are different models for conscription. And I think most people are familiar with the Scandinavian model, which is actually very selective and doesn't involve mass mobilisation. And then there's the Baltic model, which is much larger scale. So yeah, it's a spectrum.
Yep. Yeah. All right, we might switch to another question. One over here.
That helps. All right. My name's Adam. I work for the Department of Defense. Question to you, Professor Kilcullen, but happy for the rest of the panel to comment. I'm sympathetic to your view that deterrence doesn't necessarily stop when conflict starts, but that raises a problem that's been around since Schelling, which is how you draw the line between deterrence and defense. Is there a line there? And if so, how do we mark it?
I don't think there's a clear difference between deterrence and defense. I think the difference is between deterrence and compellence. And I think the way that I would approach that analytically would be the work of a guy like Dima Adamski and his notion of Russian cross-domain coercion, where you have a number of different domains, much more broadly defined than our warfighting domains, to include a bunch of other activities, and think about them as dials that you can dial up and dial down in order to achieve an effect. That only works if you've got a unified concept, and it only works if you've got a single brain behind it that can do that. And obviously the Chinese have a slightly different approach. They talk about holistic national defence, and if you look on their website where they publish that, they're basically telling on themselves because they list all the things that they use for pressuring others. So I think thinking about how you would impose that sort of sliding scale model between deterrence and coercion is the way to unlock that. I just had one other thing though. We often talk about deterrence. The flip side of deterrence is reassurance. So communicating to your potential adversary, we're not looking for a war, we're not trying to start something here. And that's why there was a hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, for exactly that reason. We haven't talked about nuclear warfare in detail, but even in the case of a global level thermonuclear exchange, I still think there would be intra-war deterrence, right? Probably quick, but for a limited nuclear exchange, absolutely. And I think we will be surprised when it inevitably happens, how low the casualty numbers are from tactical nuclear exchanges. And I think the risk is not going to be that it suddenly escalates to Armageddon. It's going to be that people across the world go, oh, is that it? And it becomes normalized. And that's something for us to consider as well here.
Okay, I think there was a question over here.
I'll go without the microphone. Tim Slattery from Pentagram Advisory. Are we clear about what we're deterring against from the point of view of the adversary's adverse actions towards us? Invasion of mainland Australia is not really a likely outcome. It would strike me that coherence of the economy and the society for which we need critical infrastructure to be operating, is that something that we're more trying to deter the adversary from interdicting and damaging?
I could pick up on that. Absolutely, right? That really is the heart of what we're, deterrence by denial, I think, is trying to do. For us, there isn't this immediate threat of, China or the CCP or any other nation invading Australia in the current circumstance. That might change under some other scenario and we get involved and we became a target. That's completely different. But and we should consider that and plan and prepare and think that through. But to deter us from being a target, those are the things that we need to consider, and from being coerced from staying out of a scenario. Any scenario that we feel that our interests are challenged, right? So what do we need to do so that we can actually deter or punish or be part of significant changes to our region? That includes the critical infrastructure. That includes having the right capabilities. That means signaling what matters to us. That means exercising with our allies and partners and raising the credibility, but also ensuring that we have the political will that I don't think that currently exists to do those things. So I think being really clear about what the threats are is an important step forward for that.
Yeah, and to the point, and it's a really good question. My own approach is that it's temporal. So deterrence in a geostrategic context sits within our alliance framework, and the NDS sort of says that in its sort of opening montage. We're looking to be able to achieve deterrence at an operational level in space and time when we choose to do so. So in the context of a regional crisis, we've either got a surface action group or you've got an undersea threat. You want ASW capability that puts a P8 off northwestern Australia with the ability to make sure there's nothing in that region because we have the ability to control it, And so again, if the Crimson Tide situation sort of comes to it, we can do something about it. But it's not about force on force. It's about acting within the alliance framework, but also having the sovereignty and self-determinative ability to achieve deterrence across a certain area when we choose to do so.
One of the examples of Russian action in Crimea, particularly in 2014, but also more recently, is what I've described in some of my work as decisive shaping. So the notion that the shaping phase of the campaign is the decisive phase. If you're not sure that you're going to win, you don't roll the tanks, right? Because it's the shaping phase where you guarantee to decision makers the outcome. Now, in the case of 2022, the Russians made a major mistake about what was going to be the outcome of their initial coup de main operation. But what that means is if you're deterring an adversary that approaches you using a hybrid campaign with a decisive shaping mindset, you only can deter in the shaping phase, right? So that means you have to be out there, and it's, as you implied, it's most likely and most dangerous enemy course of action. Then an I&W problem, an indicators and warnings problem, that identifies how would I know what course of action they're adopting, when would I know that, where would be the observables that I would see that, and they become your points of contention where you are trying to inflect the adversary's decision calculus away from doing the attack. I will just say, obviously enough, this work is being done. It's not being discussed in public. And I think that's a gap. We need to, at some point, be ready to have a national conversation about it.
Any final thought, Andrew?
Yeah, I'll amplify off what Dave was talking about with regards to decisive shaping, because if we're talking about an aspect of isolating a target, dividing their alliances, undermining their rule of law, all of these types of subversive things, Dave's earlier point also about reassurance comes to play, because viewing the world from Ret'd's perspective, there's 200 odd other countries that are out there in that ecosystem. Providing the right level of assurance to those other small countries that are out there to help them become poisoned shrimp may actually be part of how we can provide a level of deterrence by denial, of undermining that alliance fracturing, complicating that calculus in a way that I think points towards your issue of who are we deterring from what, where the decisive bit is that shaping element.
Great. All right. Hey, unfortunately, we're out of time, but the paper is out next week. It goes into a lot of these issues in more detail, and I commend it to you. Thank you all for coming out this evening. There are refreshments available after, and our panellists will be around for some of that if you do have pressing issues you still want to follow up on. And could you please all show your appreciation to our panellists for